What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Every Calorie Counts podcast. Today we have Camp Jansen on here. We're still waiting on Cameron, but Justin's here, Dom Kuz is here, obviously Tim is here, and I am here. We're going to go into everything leading up to peak week, touch on peak week. Oh, there he is. Let me admit, Cam.
I don't know what we're talking about.
And let's rock.
We started without
you.
Sorry, guys. It took forever to turn on.
No big deal. We were just getting
Okay.
rolling though. We already started recording. So we're basically talking today about the last basically like 3 to 4 weeks of contest prep and what we're doing, kind of like a roundtable assessment from Camp Jansen. You know, the one thing I've talked to both Justin and Dom, obviously this is our first time having Cam on the show, but I've talked to you separately about it before. And the one thing I talked to all three of you guys about is your ability, Camp Jansen's ability specifically, leading all the way up to Matt, to have athletes on stage with a very particular, it's nailed 24/7 with you guys. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things where I feel like if there's any group of people that we could have on the call to talk about how to set up somebody's contest prep, to have them ready for that perfect peak week. In my estimation, a lot of times peak week, and we all know this shit now, like people talk for years about, you know, the crazy shit that goes on with peak week. And, you know, even years and years ago with the fucking aldactone loading and then this diuretic and that diuretic on top and all this crazy shit that goes on. It's kind of like the most important thing for me in terms of peak week is making sure that we have those last 3 to 4 weeks dialed in appropriately. And then we can kind of cruise right through a peak week and really rely more on our eyes and the way that the athlete's reacting within that moment, as opposed to any type of like crazy, you know, long thought out fucking protocol that somebody might have set up, right? So again, the last 3 to 4 weeks is kind of where we're picking up. And I think as a broad concept here, just to like cut anybody off real quick, it's one of those things where it's like, obviously, again, the idea of being a coach in a bodybuilding is you're using your eyes, you're reacting to what's going on. All of this is for a broad concept, kind of like entertainment purposes. If you want to call it education, fine, but like we're more entertainment based, I think, than anything else. So it's like, you know, we're looking at it from that perspective. The concept here up front would be people are dialed in already. I think we can all agree on that. We don't need to waste any time saying like, if you're fat free, then you could, of course, if you like that's a prerequisite here, is that somebody's in shape, right? Somebody's ready to go for these last 4 weeks. And it's really just about managing those larger variables that we're going to manage during a contest prep at this time and what you guys are doing about that. So again, all that kind of prerequisite shit is taken care of here. And we're all fucking on the same, you know, playing field in terms of where the athlete's at this point, right? Does that make sense?
For sure.
Yep.
So the few things that we have written down, and I guess the best place to start here would be the bigger rocks that we're moving. So first and foremost, I have, you know, management of recovery and fatigue, and then we can kind of add refeeds in there, as that's obviously going to be part of that. So anything with bringing in more food, refeeds, management of recovery and fatigue, and I put in parentheses there, training volume, cardio reductions, deloads in general from training, lifestyle aspect as well. So this might be, you know, if we know a client has a specific job and we got to manage sleep and all that different stuff, you know, what are we really going through with clients at this point, 3 or 4 weeks out, with those variables? Who wants to kick it off?
So going into, I guess there's a couple things, like around 3 weeks out is really when I try to get as many variables controlled as possible. That's when I'm really figuring out what kind of sodium intake looks good on the guy, what kind of water intake is consistent for them. I think one thing that's useful there is doing it 3 weeks out. Like, for example, I got a guy competing tomorrow, and we were troubleshooting his salt intake around 3.5 weeks, 3 weeks out. And we ended up like really overshooting it. And he gained like 11 pounds, like swelled up like a balloon. But like, luckily, you know, we did it you know, that's why you do it that far out, so that you can adjust if you need to. And that's a huge thing that I think a lot of people try to figure out too last minute. And then they're, you know, struggling to figure out what kind of salt they should be giving somebody. And then honestly, I think like those are probably two of the most crucial things at that point. I'm using refeeds in that to really just play off a recovery for people that close to a show. I'm not trying to like super saturate them that close to a show, just because I'm trying to gauge like okay, this refeed at this amount of food got them this full. That helps me understand kind of where I want to set their carb load. So that's one of the reasons why, like, when I refeed people like inside a month out, I'm not trying to like super saturate, spill them or anything like that, because I'm getting a good idea from like, okay, where's our starting point with their carb load. So that's like another thing that I pay a lot of attention to around like 4 or 3 weeks out.
Yeah.
And I
And
think
just
like doing that gets you set up to have really like honestly seamless peaks. In my opinion, you should be able to kind of just write a peak and make really small tweaks to it at the end of it all.
Yeah, and just so you guys know too, sodium, potassium, water, that was all going to be my next bullet point here to kind of go off of. Initially here though, Dom, are you doing anything as far as pulling back training volume, doing anything with changing training at this point, 3 or 4 weeks out whatsoever, or looking at, as you're bringing in more food, are you doing anything around that in terms of like, maybe pulling down cardio or anything of that nature to be
Yeah,
able to kind of
so kind of by
standardize
default, I reduce cardio when I refeed or pull it completely.
in general?
Yeah, just in general, just from a fatigue management standpoint. So anytime I am really trying to get recovery at its highest, I match it with high cals. So I'll reduce cardio to maybe nothing that day. And then one of the other things that I look at too from training is I won't really reduce volume. I'll just maybe change selections, maybe move away from free bar stuff, go to more machine stuff. I do think from a mental aspect too, it's nice at the end of the prep to reduce the time spent in the gym because people are pretty fried at that point. So the less warm-up time required, maybe the better training session they end up having because they're not there for 2 hours, 3 hours. I think that from a mental side actually helps the athlete a good bit. So that's something I do with training.
Okay. What about you guys? Anything, Cam, anything you want to add on that as far as a fatigue standpoint, kind of managing that, refeeds at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dom, Justin, and I, we maintain a lot of the same core principles, probably methods and approach to that final month of a prep. Any kind of fatigue management, I think it's going to look a good bit more different during the actual peak week. That's where you're really going to have big reductions in intensity. Whereas I feel like if you're really starting to back off a ton on intensity around 3 to 4 weeks out, you're probably leaving some room for error when it comes to just muscle retention, especially depending on how hard you're digging. Where I would see possible changes within training at still the 3 to 4 week out mark would probably just be adjustments within volume, just matching work capacities as you're pushing down harder and harder. But I would still encourage keeping the intensity parameters up and consistent, for the most part during periods while you're dieting down, unless you're, having some kind of refeed or a higher day just to reduce fatigue in that given moment. But yeah.
Anything you want to add to that, Justin?
Really, because when it comes to the training aspect of things, I mean, I like to keep it as consistent as possible for as long as possible. And I'm a high intensity trainer as is, so I'm not a big volume guy. So for me, it's like, and most of my guys, I just want to just know if they're starting to pull back in the gym at all. When their performance markers start to drop a bit is when I'll say, okay, hey, let's focus on trying to keep performance as high as possible. So let's maybe pull some volume out. So I'll do volume reductions way before I'll ever ask them to like back off just how intensely they're actually training. And for me, intensity is a percentage of 1 rep max. That's a word that's used incorrectly a bit too often. Intensity is really in regards to load lifted when we're actually like looking at it. So I like my guys to still train relatively heavy for as long as they can within a safe manner, but the volume is the thing that I'll pull back. And truthfully, if you're having a flawless prep, one shouldn't have to do a ton of volume reduction throughout prep, because it should be within your maximum recoverable volume throughout the entirety of prep. So if you're doing fatigue management throughout prep, which we do through refeeds, we pull cardio at different times, we'll pull fat burners at times, like obviously all of these things are useful for not only just the cosmetics, but for the reduction of fatigue, then doing a ton of manipulation with the training isn't necessary in most cases. Like even right now, like with what Cameron was saying, peak week is really the time that I feel like you start to notice the most of that. That's when you start really pulling back. But 2 weeks out, if you're good and you feel good and your training is good, don't change anything. Just leave it the same. Keep it consistent.
One thing I noticed last year with some of our guys, or at least one of my guys, was like you don't want to, like, I feel like most certainly at that point too, you don't want to change the mindset at all of the athlete. You know what I mean? Like if they're going in there every single day and they're still ready to train, and you're telling them preemptively, like, hey, let's pull out this because maybe they're in my ear saying that they're a little fatigued or a little bit. It's almost like that's the one time where everybody's kind of ready to go. You know what I mean? Like they're like at least they should be. Like it's kind of like, you know, it's their version of like going to war and like, you know, ready to like, you know, do the fucking thing. So it's like, don't pull down on that if it's not necessary. But, you know, to your point though, and I'm glad you said that about intensity too. It's something that we talk about all the time. Is like, that's a real thing here, a real principle here. Like it's not an emotion, it's not a feeling. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
there's a real like measurable concept there that we can look at. So maybe it is going from, you know, whatever, 2 working sets to 1 working set to try to keep somebody to a point where they're not beating themselves to death. But at the end of the day, yeah. So I think we're all on the same page there. But now going forward, nutrition, I think it was going to be the big thing here. And that's where we're at now is like nutritional setup. So things, and this might be like you talked about, Dom, already, and brought in like sodium, and trying to standardize that. And I know maybe, I don't know if you guys have different approaches. I think everybody knows about Cam's, you know, salt packets at this point, but if you guys have different ways of approaching it, like sodium measurement, are you guys doing anything to measure and or standardize potassium, water? And then from a nutritional standpoint in general, like, are you guys doing anything in terms of your setup throughout the course of the week so that it kind of like lands? Like, you know, one thing that I've done a lot is like making sure that even at that point out, that I'm almost trying to put their process in a place where it's like earlier in the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday might be look a little bit more like depletion days, or at that point they're still fat loss days. And then if I am refeeding somebody, it's closer to the end of the week there if it's possible, so that I can start to get a gauge of how their body's looking throughout the course of the week and then what ultimately it might look like on that Saturday. Are you guys thinking that far ahead at that point, or is there anything, you know, or even when it comes to the fact of like, let's be real, the one thing that drives me nuts here is I hear some people always talking about like, you know, you should be ready, you know, 4 weeks out, 5 weeks out, 6 weeks out, this crazy shit. And then it's like, you know, you just set your week up and then you standard. And then it's like, you find that look that looks good and you can ride that into. And in my head, I'm like, dude, I'm having people dig at that point. Like, that's the point where I'm really like dropping the hammer. We're digging stuff. We're bringing somebody in. So those last couple of weeks, like, and their body's still changing at that point. So it's hard in a lot of cases to be able to find that look, whatever, 4 weeks out, when I still have room to go for these next 2 weeks leading into a show. So anything that you guys want to touch on there from a nutritional setup, or Dom, you already brought up sodium, potassium, water, but if there's any other way that you guys look at it, what do you got, Justin?
Like I mean, I stole bacon from Cameron, so that's a peak week thing. But what was the question again? I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I'm answering it properly.
So nutritional, anything from like a nutritional standpoint that we're setting up 3 or 4 weeks out. And like I said, Don brought up the big thing there with sodium, potassium.
That's fat loss time, man. Like 4 weeks out, like I mean, you should be close to ready, but like you should look crazy at 4 weeks out. But that's like a nice blend of like you're not sucked down super flat, but you're shredded, you know what I mean? So then it's like, okay, 2 more weeks of really hard digging. Like 2 weeks out, like at the 2 week out mark is like, okay, we're really close.
Yeah.
Like really close. Like, hey, 5 to 6 more days of like digging. And then like, okay, we're off the gas then. You know, like if you can start, I mean, Cameron does the same thing as me when it comes to this, but like at 10 days out, if you can start the reverse diet, start the reverse diet, you know, because it's like, well, the fat loss is gone, you know, like there's only so much body fat that you're going to take off. So, and like, this is something I've learned, you know, maybe the hard way, but like the idea of like, oh, there's always fat that you can take off. Well, yes, but at what cost? You know what I mean? Like what are we sacrificing the look then at that point? Some people don't look good with striated glutes because they lose everything else. Like for them to get to that point of body fat and conditioning, their physique just sucks down so much that they lose, it looks like they lose pounds of tissue. In reality, they don't, but they're losing a lot of fullness that then takes weeks to come back. It doesn't take a couple days of artificial eating to come back. It takes weeks. So it's like it's hard because like a lot of us, me, Dom, Cameron, like we work with a lot of people like as our first times. Like we have a lot of business. So like a lot of these preps that we do with these people are maybe first time peaks. Cameron's peaking 2 people for the very first time. They're right now. You know what I mean? And it's a pro show. It's the Toronto Pro. Like it's like this is like the big deal. So that's hard to nail it and know what their best look is right off the rip the first time when you don't know, like, hey, how far do I have to dig this guy down condition wise or this girl down without ruining their look by just blindly chasing conditioning. So, up until, I mean, I would like my people to be ready 2 weeks out, but if they're ready fat loss wise at 10 days out, 9 days out, 8 days out, okay, cool. I'm pulling back. Like I'm pulling cardio down. I'm going to add a little bit of food in, and I'm just going to try and keep stress and cortisol low. And then if I can slowly add food throughout the last 7 to 8 days into the show, well, then that, in my opinion, gets their body fresh and it has way more life. And there's real pop to the muscle as opposed to, again, the 48-hour artificial fullness that we do at the end where we think we're going to carb them up and dig them out of this, 10-week hole that they've been in now in 2 days, which doesn't happen.
Which really ends up being like a game of minutes too. There, like, do we, in the last
and then
hours,
then you're like every 30 minutes you're worried if they're gonna look better or look worse after that next meal. So
and I think there's different levels of readiness. You know what I mean? Like there's a look that's ready for 2 weeks out. There's a look that's ready at 10 days out. And then there's a look that's ready on show day, and I think that to say someone's ready at 2 weeks out, like, I think it's a very hard thing to come by and an unrealistic thing to come by because they're truly not. There's still a lot of things that are going to happen. There's still a lot of changes that are going to be made. And I just think that the variables and manipulations that are going to be made leading in, the final 48 hours of that, contest prep and peak week, you're not going to pull that completely out of somebody until you do it. And having someone quote unquote ready at 10 days out, like, yes, it's a ready spot for 10 days out, but that more so, again, kind of what Justin was saying, that then lines you up to start to reduce the fatigue. Are they going to get a ton of fat off over the next 10 days? No, it might be marginal, especially if you're starting to pull back. But I look at peaking as almost like a two-step process. And the first step is starting to reduce inflammation and fatigue, because then that's setting you up for digestion to be in a place to absorb the nutrients and uptake the food right. Getting the athlete mentally prepared and kind of ready for what's about to happen over those final 72 hours and having them calm and ready for the show. And then actually, loading that physique up and kind of just fine tuning all the details and keeping them, alive whenever you are pulling back and drying out the physique.
Yeah, I think you brought up something that's cool there too, as far as the digestion. A lot of people talk about pulling back, reductions in fatigue, like all that different stuff that last week and so. And it's like, dude, a lot of that is going to come back to the way that your body assimilates a lot of what we're putting in there, absorbing a lot of what we're putting in there. And, obviously, if we're trying to load somebody up, we want them to be able to use that food as best as possible, making sure that they're able to go to the bathroom in a less stressed state and all that different stuff. But it's, it's interesting. You brought up, that, like, you both of you guys brought up that 10-day window. And I think, and I don't want anything I said earlier to kind of, my whole thing was, and I think you guys would agree with this because, again, my point here is that we're saying two different things. But I think there's a lot of results that somebody can make in 10 days too. So again, leading up to that 10-day mark where you're starting to reverse somebody, I think the biggest thing that we're missing right now in the industry is, like, when it comes to a lot of the education that goes on, is that, again, it's, be ready 3-4 weeks out. And kind of what you guys are saying and what I'm saying is the same, in the sense that, like, hey, there's a lot of room to be had in those last 4 weeks in terms of bringing conditioning, as long as you're not overdoing it, to Justin's point, and spoiling the look with, driving a little bit too far. That would be my concern. And what I had to learn in years and years past was, trying to have somebody ready 4 weeks out, you're running that risk sometimes of those guys that don't maintain that fullness, or those women that don't maintain that certain level of fullness. And now you're 4 weeks out. It's like, now we're chasing it. And every single week I'm trying to put more food in and more food in and more food in just to keep that certain level of fullness. And what I had to learn the hard way was, it's like, hey, if I keep this person between like that 8 to whatever, even like 3-week out mark, like 10 to 3-week out mark, somewhere in there, in a place where it's like, I know if I drop this and I drop that over the course of the next, whatever, 10, 12, 15 days, that you can get a lot of results when somebody's primed and ready for it in those last few weeks within just that small time frame there to kind of push them to that point where now they're ready to potentially be reversed into the show or start to play around with different peaking strategies, reductions in fatigues and yada, 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 all that different stuff. But again, it's a thing for me recently that we hear so many people talking about, again, be ready 4 weeks out, be ready 3 weeks. And then it's just like a matter of testing things over and over again. Like it's some sort of everybody's unanimously peeled now at 3 weeks out from a show. And we have no issues with people bringing in proper conditioning. But anything you want to add, Dom? Because I know you brought up the sodium potassium thing before. How do you go about standardizing that for your athletes?
So just to speak on the be ready thing, I think what it should be said is like, be ready for a good peak week, 2 weeks out,
Right.
3 weeks out. Like
Yeah,
you
perfect.
should be, we should look at you and be like, okay, they just need a good peak week and they'll have a really good look on stage.
Right.
Which is a body fat thing and you can tell, but I think a lot of people who try to hold looks like that or like replicate stuff, it usually doesn't correlate to stage, which you can see a lot of the time. But for the salt thing, I usually just ask like, hey, like, what have you been salting your food with? Like, what have you been doing? Right. If we didn't already standardize it like from the beginning, some guys we do, some guys we don't. And then they just tell me, and if they, are pretty accurate with it, I just follow what they've been doing. And then I'll troubleshoot like a little bit more, a little bit less. And then after a few days of that, we kind of find the sweet spot and we're pretty in a good spot. Like that guy, like that really big water retention thing that happened, it was pretty easy to fix. We just hyperhydrated for a few days, dropped his sodium pretty low, and then retried a much lower sodium intake, and he was back to normal weight in a few days.
Of course, yeah. Anything that you do there, Justin, from like a standardization standpoint, like how are you having people measure their sodium and or potassium if you're doing anything with that?
I do mine differently than Cameron and Dom because I don't like standardize it the way they do. I do cracks and shakes. So I'm like, hey, how many cracks and shakes are you putting on your meal? So, because you either shake salt or you crack it. So it's like, well, how many do you do? And then they'll be like, oh, I use, because everyone has their rhythm. It's like, and it's like, okay, that's your rhythm. So how many was that? 3? All right, cool. That's how many you get to do every meal. That's normal salt. And then I just add from there. This is the first year that I've actually played around with reducing sodium. I've never reduced sodium ever. Like in every peak, and I've nailed peaks like without ever reducing sodium. My standard is not to reduce it. But if I have somebody who is really water retentive or they're not responding to diazide or something like that, like they're just not flushing, and because we should have a scale response when we're getting drier, right? Like water weighs a lot of, like the water has a lot of mass. So we should, if somebody's getting drier and you're not at the same time filling them with glycogen, their weight should be coming down. It doesn't always work that way. And if they're not coming down on the scale, they're not probably flushing as much water as we think. So in an effort to get the scale down and get more pounds of water off, I've played around with actually reducing sodium this year. And it's worked. It's worked really, really well. Now it's a slippery slope though, because you can get kind of crazy. And then you don't have enough sodium, and then your Na to K ratio is really skewed heavily towards potassium, which isn't really what you want, like on stage at least. And it's another variable. So anytime you're adding variables in that you're changing, like going down and up and kind of doing this, it takes a practiced eye. So I've had to learn very quickly this year, but it's worked. So that's the only time that I really like standardize when it comes to that. Around 3-4 weeks out, I'll ask them, hey, how much salt are you using per meal? And then I ask them in those parameters, hey, how many cracks or shakes? And and I just keep it like that. And the reason why I keep it that way is because it's simple. And that's the metrics that I know. And it's easy for me to maintain. And I've done hundreds of peaks that way. So I'm kind of not wanting to do like this many milligrams of salt and stuff like that, because it would be foreign to me. So that's how. But when I'm sorry, one other thing, when I'm pulling sodium down, I'm usually increasing potassium. So I use the new salt. I'm not sure if you know what that is.
Yeah.
So I use that, and I'll use yellow mustard as well. So yellow mustard with new salt. I learned that from AJ Sims, and these people just flush water like crazy when I do that. And I'll pull sodium pretty hard. Like I might be like, hey, cut all sodium out this day, out beyond what you've cooked your food in. So like I let people season their meats and stuff like that when they're cooking it, but I won't have them add additional salt to any of their meals like right before they eat it, like you typically would. So like
Now
right now,
we're talking when you're saying that though, we're talking more peak week
that's
concept
peak
there,
week
right?
stuff. That's
Yeah.
peak week stuff. But like up until that point, I do right around 3-4 weeks out is like them to be very consistent with it. But I'm a high sodium guy, so like throughout prep, if they're having a hard time getting pumps or anything like that, like muscle contractions aren't the greatest, sodium baby, and they just lather it up. That's that's what helps.
Yeah, I see a lot of people. That was one thing that was kind of crazy there for a little while too. The amount of sodium some people are putting in shit. Like there's people like where they're literally talking about like 2-3 grams of sodium, 4 grams of sodium in somebody's intra workout shake, and it's like as you get closer through that into that's like fucking what is that like 2 tablespoons of salt or some shit like that. It's a lot of fucking salt. You going that high?
Not that high, no, but I mean, I mean, at that, like before the show, maybe. I mean, like it's like,
well, but again, you're talking the day
right
up
in their mouth. So
yeah,
I
you're
mean,
talking
like,
the day up though, right? You're talking
yeah,
right before
yeah,
stage,
like,
yeah,
but
yeah.
no, I really like to keep salt pretty consistent throughout.
Yeah, consistent.
It can go up, and there's reasons for it to go up too. Like again, you're depleted. You're trying to hold a little bit of fullness in the muscle. You're trying to get a decent contraction, decent workout. You want to get a pump. And then that's even for myself, being still actively in the circuit, like, like I'll bang some extra sodium on a day that I feel pretty flat or that I'm pretty run down just to make sure I can get a good training session in. At the end of the day, the most important thing is the training. So if I have to manipulate sodium upwards to have a good workout, then that's what I'm gonna do.
Now, real quick on that, because I don't want to spend too long on peak week. We said we were going to lead up, and now I still want to get into some of these supplement things that we have set up here. But like, as far as the sodium, potassium things, you're getting closer to show. When is that something that you're doing, like the yellow mustard and potassium thing? Is that something that you're doing? To me, this is one of those things, and I want to hear what you guys are doing. I'm trying to like suck that up and get some free info here, right? But like, is that something that you're doing really like honestly based on the look of the athlete? Right?
Yes.
Like obviously that's super dependent on the athlete. But when you're going all yellow mustard and potassium, are you doing that the day before, like on a Friday, or are you doing that on the Saturday of the show? When are you doing that?
For a Saturday show, maybe Wednesday or Thursday.
Gotcha.
Maybe both. It depends.
Yeah,
the
idea
the get dry days, the days that you're trying to.
The idea is that you get the water off, and then you worry about fullness.
Yes.
Right.
That's kind of the thought process with that.
Yeah.
Right.
Get dry, then fill.
Gotcha. All right. So now, as far as the like I said, now we're into kind of the supplement side of things here. So we're looking at it obviously from a PED perspective, right? Even though I know, listen, fucking, we could talk all day about whatever other supplements you guys are
talk about drugs,
whatever, cortisol management and all that other stuff. But you guys know what people want to fucking hear about here. Yeah. But yeah. So I think a big thing that people, what's that?
I said we're the bodybuilding coaches. What the fuck? Who cares?
I want to hear all about the fucking ashwagandha that you guys are using.
Yeah, right. KSM.
Hey, bro, I formulate supplements.
I know.
Yeah,
I was gonna throw it. I was
I'm
gonna
gonna
say
go
the
take a
cortisol
bathroom
product.
break. You guys can talk to Dom about the over-the-counter stuff.
Yeah. But so like at this point we're looking more at like the again variables and what we can control on a consistent basis here. So again, for me the biggest thing is like are you guys moving from longer esters to short esters, or when did you do that at this point, and how are you managing it going into this? And then the other thing for me, and this is now we're talking about obviously androgen specifically, we can go into GH thereafter, estrogen control thereafter, but specifically as it relates to our base players there, like what are you doing as far as manipulating testosterone at this point, and how are you going about that for most people, right? Obviously, again, we know this is very dependent on the individual's look, but as a broad concept here, where are you guys going with these things? Long esters to short esters, the compounds that are being used, et cetera. Are you setting up orals this far out, or is that something you're saving a little bit more for peak week? Like, where are we going with this?
I do stuff a little differently than them. I don't use short ester tests. I keep them on long ester, but I taper appropriately based off half-lives. So I usually reduce dosage around like 6-7 weeks out, and then do another reduction so that by the time peak week comes around, they're pretty much on trace half-lives that are in their system still. I don't really switch to a short ester. Same with my mass. My mass stays long ester the whole time. I just do that from from a oil volume perspective. Half-lives accumulate systemically. You'll reach peak plasma levels. Like when people think they're on 500 milligrams of test a week, after a few weeks, you're not on 500 milligrams of test a week, right? So I play off of that. And I find a lot of the guys that like it, because towards the end of prep, they're like barely injecting because the long ester test is gone. The long ester mass is there. They can spread it out a little bit more. And they just, some of my guys really like it. So I've been doing it for a while. And I mean, maybe that comes from like my understanding of drugs is probably a lot higher than the average coach, but I just feel like that's where I don't see the need to really switch to short esters because every injection causes a spike in aromatization. So I rather have no spikes in aromatization as we get closer and closer to peak week. That's why I do the long ester test. And that works pretty well. And I'm never worried about them not having tests in their system because when I'm doing my reduction and then when I'm pulling it, we have, tests E and SIP have about a 4 to 5 half-life time for it to be completely gone. That's 30 plus days to reach an amount that's, negating, right? So that's, I never really worry about them not having tests in their system the day of a show.
What about you, Justin?
That's like flawless answer, man. I didn't know that. Actually, that's like really cool to hear that. I had no idea that that's what you did. I knew the test thing, but I didn't know that you kept mast in long ester like that. I also know that you bring mast in way earlier than I do.
I start prep on mast.
I know you do, and I started putting mast in like way earlier with some people.
I bring in mast when you do. I typically bring in mast when I drop the primo, probably like 8 weeks out or so.
Yeah, I start prep with mast.
I will layer them at times. Like when I start to creep mast in, like I'll have primo in, mast will come in. Usually what I do is I start doing this with the mast and the primo. I'll like clear some room with the primo coming down to make room for the mast because I do use short esters, which primo is a long ester, but it's still only 100 megs per milliliter. So you still got to bang a bunch of it. So shit, I'm trying to get like back into I mean, I use mostly short acting stuff towards the end of the prep, like, Tren-Ace, mass probe, stuff like that. I do switch to test probe. But honestly, I'll switch that at like 4 weeks out. And my testosterone levels with test probe usually don't go over 400 milligrams for oil volume purposes. And quite frankly, like, I don't really feel like you need a bunch of testosterone in your system by that point because Mastron could be anywhere between 300 and 600 milligrams at 400 at 4 weeks out. It depends on the athlete. Like I love Mastron, like I love it. I use it in my off seasons for myself. Like I'm a big believer in it. Not the John Jewett method where they run TRT and then 2 grams of it, but like I still like myself some Mastron. But and then I've also done some things differently with Tren this year where I've actually kept it a good bit lower. Like 450 milligrams of Tren really wasn't out of the question for a while, but quite frankly, I just feel like it fucks too much stuff up because like you're not sleeping, you're like really aggressive, and like I don't know about you, but I don't know, like, I don't know if you guys have ever had this experience, but like I like have this hint of red to my skin, like when I'm on a bunch of Tren, like I'm just red. And I don't know if that's because my blood pressure is through the roof or whatnot, but like
we're white guys, dude. Like that level of white.
I know, but like I live in Florida, I should be tan and I look like a tomato. I'm like red as hell when I'm on like a lot of Tren. And so I like getting enough of the effects out of it. Like 150, 225 milligrams a week is like a really sweet spot with it, to be honest. And sometimes daily injections of Tren make it way more tolerable. Just because it's smaller spikes, right? You're kind of just keeping yourself here. And then like, I guess the orals question, I get kind of aggressive, but I don't know how much I want to divulge.
Enough Winstrol to fucking take out a small child the week of.
Not necessarily that, but like, I start prep with Anavar, and Anavar for me comes in pretty early. And I just don't feel like I'm risking much with it as far as like, liver toxicity and just accumulating like too much toxic load with Anavar, especially because like the source that I have for my athletes and myself, like it's legitimate pharmaceutical Anavar. Like Par Anavar is the last pharmaceutical brand made in the US, and that's what they get. So I can vouch for quality. And I'll start that maybe 12 weeks out. And from 12 weeks out to 6 weeks out, like they might be, using some Anavar. And then my next one is Proviron. I'll bring that in second. Winstrol comes in third. And then so I'll run those three at times together. Again, I feel like they work really well together. Beyond that, though, is when it gets to be too much, and I don't run those three and then add Halo on top of it. That's overkill in my opinion. And again, dosage dependent on how much we're talking and what we're running all together. But Anavar will come out, and then the earliest that I bring Tren in is 4 weeks out. Or sorry, Halo. Excuse me, I misspoke. Halo is I'll bring that in 4 weeks out. But a lot of times, like it's like 3 weeks out. It's like 2 weeks out. You know what I mean? Like shit. Sometimes I forget, and I'm like looking at the athlete, and I'm like, man, they look so good. I'm like, I don't want to change anything. Like drugs don't need to be changed. You look phenomenal. And like you're just getting harder every single day. And then I'm like, oh shit, I don't even have Halo in. And so I'm like, all right, well, let's put 20 milligrams of Halo in and see. I've actually been pulling Halo a lot more recently. And I don't know if you guys have noticed this with your preps this year, but like I'm seeing Halo making people hold a lot more than I've ever seen it hold. And I've been pulling it.
I don't use it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
For the same reasons that people talk about Tren, I usually see that more with the Halo in terms of the individual side effects with Halo than I even do with the Tren. And again, Tren, you can moderate the dosage a little bit more easily, but like you said, holding water a little bit, but just kind of like that tense, like like it's just it can be too much, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, I would rather use the milligrammage for like more Winnie or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of the same rate. And like when I've pulled the Halo out, I've been like, okay, well, I'll just give you a little bit more Proviron and Winstrol and call it a day.
Yeah,
So I've pulled Halo a lot this year.
I think Justin, I probably do a lot of the same when it comes to the orals. The way that I'll look at Anavar and probably Halo and when I deploy them are very similar in the sense of those are two compounds that you can really leverage hard training with when the going gets tough. Like Anavar, you start a prep with someone, they're starting to hit that 12-week out mark. That's probably where they're first starting to notice some bits of their training starting to get a little bit more difficult. And I feel like the Anavar really provides a good neurological drive and just boost to their training to keep pushing on down without really having to pump the brakes. And then Halo, same thing. It's probably anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks out. And again, it's that I feel like has been a big driver with people's training too, to really push out hard sessions. But yeah, pretty much all on the same with everything else that Justin said.
So as you guys are going week of, right? Like I think from what I'm getting from you guys, like the one oral that really stands out there is Halo for Cameron and Justin, and then for Dom, you're replacing that with what? The Winstrol?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Winstrol.
And now, do you guys feel like? And now we're kind of on week of here, so we're kind of removing from our normal conversation there. But now, week of, are you guys bringing in any other major players there? And obviously, this might be dependent on the person to be able to drive specific, looks that we're going for there.
I don't. I keep drugs consistent week of. I just think increases in androgen loads the week of could, depending on the person, probably cause some unnecessary water retention that you probably could have avoided. To milk out an extra 1-2% of the look, in my head, I just say, we found your sweet spot with your drugs. Let's just stay at that this week.
But again, for you leading into that, you're looking at, because you said before, Masteron is basically your thing. So let's say we're tapering off tests for you. Masteron's there as a standard player, and then you're Winstrol into the show. So you already have that kind of like, you've already been kind of developing that look as far as the
yeah. So they're reaching like peak doses probably like by 3 weeks out, riding that out to show day. That's going to be Mass, Tren, Winstrol, Proviron.
Gotcha. What about you guys? Anything different for you, Justin?
If I'm gonna
bring week of.
Yeah, week of. I mean, like it depends on the person. I'll use Letro at the end.
I
Just
was
to
going to
get
touch on estrogen next.
yeah, just to get really hard and really dry if I feel like they can handle it. So the only people that I think really benefit from Letro are the really bubbly guys and girls. Because then they won't get like real stringy and flat. But like you got like a regular old white boy up there and they're gonna go flat as fuck. And it
Yeah, I
just
had to learn
doesn't
that the
look
hard
good.
way.
You know, it just like any fullness that they had is gone. And I do think you can overdo it with AIs. Now that's like kind of contradictory because like I get pretty aggressive with them at the end with the right combination of like the genetic makeup of the person. So like Tonio can handle Letro, but I probably can't because and like so like Matt doesn't really use it with me. I get really dry without it, but like I'm not bubbly at all. So like I would just be flat and it wouldn't enhance my look. So that's a player that I'll bring in usually like 7 days out. So like the last week, yeah. In small dosages at first, and then if I don't like it, I pull it. Peak week is when I will pull Halo if I'm gonna pull it. So like I'll give it a legit try. Like I'll put it in and I'll give it a chance to work. And if I'm not liking how it's looking and I think the look is muddy and there's a film, because really you shouldn't have a film during peak week.
Right.
You should be hard as nails. But if there's a film and it's, I think, drug related, then I'm pulling the Halo. Like just right on.
Anything to add there, Cam, as far as week of?
What I've started to do with some individuals, especially if they're ones that again aren't the more bubblier-esque type, is typically injections are daily at that point leading up to the peak week. And what I've begun to do sometimes is I'll pull the test out usually at 7 days out, and then I'll continue that mass and trend to 5 days out, or sometimes I'll move it to every other day leading up to like 4 to 5 days out, just to carry a little bit more fullness into the peak week. For the most part, I don't typically do too many alterations with drugs. I might test the waters, pushing AIs up a little bit more. Like that's what I'm doing with Blake. I noticed when we were about 3 weeks out, I had him on just like 0.5 milligram of 8X every 3 days, and moved to every other. And I felt like it took a little bit of pop out of his legs. And so I pulled him back. Now as we've gotten leaner and started to really reduce the fatigue with things, I've been able to taper it back up and his look has handled it well. And so I've scaled it up a little bit more now this peak week, or I guess just this week, and he's handling it really well again too. But I mean, maybe I'll bump up Halo during the peak week, or the last couple of days if they're handling it fine, just to drive a little bit more hardness. But for the most part, there's really not a ton of changes when it comes to androgens during the week of the show.
Yeah.
Right. So nobody's throwing in a little. My favorite thing is the super draw. No, nobody's throwing in a little bit of that.
If I use
I've
Super
used
Draw,
it.
it's in. It'll be in before.
I've done it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Go ahead, Cam.
The only time that I've like made an adjustment with it during peak week was at a guy that responded really well to it. We tested the waters with it. And I think like 3 or 4 weeks out, and I noticed with him the first 4 to 5 days that he was using it, he just had a level of fullness that came from it that was super impressive, that then kind of almost faded off, and it wasn't continuing to stay there. And then we ended up bringing it in at 4 days out for his show, and things ended up working out really well with that. But I don't know. I feel like it can really be hit or miss with super draw, and you really have to have the right individual. And compounds like that, you've got to really be confident in the cards you're playing and the risk you're taking there. Because it might not even really be that much worth it for the outcome that you possibly could have.
Yeah. I like it a lot for the guys that aren't super bubbly, for guys like myself that really do need the extra help. And like, especially for me too, in terms of food, like there's only so much that I'm going to accept as far as food is concerned without having a blown out midsection and distended stomach. So, having a little bit extra in there to help with fullness has always been a big key for me. And I think guys that aren't as bubbly as I would like them to be, right? Like it just helps a little bit. And again, to your point though, that's where I might test it earlier, but then really like the week of is where I'm kind of looking at that and maybe titrating up the dosage, even honestly, 24 to 48 hours out, potentially increasing that a little bit to add a little bit more fullness, hardness. Like that's the one thing that I found there that really, like I said, it drives that specific look that I'm going for, which is maintaining a really hard look, but at the same time, helping to fill out a little bit. So I really like the super draw for that. It almost, like, to me, especially as I'm putting food in there, it almost seems like it has a very similar effect to like what we all, they're like something, I don't know any science behind this bullshit. I have no fucking clue. But to me, it does seem like it helps a little bit from like a loading perspective in terms of having that around meals and helping to load carbohydrates a little bit. I don't know if there's any truth to that or if there's any reality to that, but it definitely feels like I can leverage that a little bit. So now, Justin brought up estrogen control, which I think, again, this is another one for me. Like you talked about it earlier, Justin, too, with like some people nowadays, it's like they're in an off season and it's fucking 300 milligrams of testosterone all the way through an off season. Like, I don't like, I've been around for a little while. I might not have worked with athletes like you guys, but I don't see many people grow on fucking 300 milligrams of test. I just don't fucking see it happening. But like, and now, and I really think it's coming all from very similar camps, right? Where it's like, and now we have people talking about where it's like, oh, if you do too many AIs, you're going to die. And it's like, all right, cool, dude. And like, we could have that conversation during an off season or during the long, but when we're coming into prep and we're talking about, we're coming into peaking and we're looking for that very specific look, I find it to be something that's really challenging. Like even you brought up, Justin, with like the difference in the physiques for the guys that are a little bit longer muscles versus the shorter, rounder guys. And it's like, regardless, to me, there's got to be some level of estrogen control going on there beyond just saying, mass run and primo lower estrogen. Okay, but I want to fucking crush estrogen to a certain extent here. And grant that might be different from person to person because, again, like you said, you'll see it in a lot of cases, especially with those longer guys in the legs. I find it more than anything else. Sometimes you'll see it in the arms, but in a lot of cases, you'll see it in the legs where those legs just start to fucking flatten out too much. But for me, estrogen control is a big factor in terms of bringing that end look. So where are you guys at with the estrogen control? I know you already brought up Letro, Justin, and being able to manage that on a guy like yourself. When you're not using Lestro, what are you going with, and what is it looking at? What is it looking like that week of as far as peak dosages?
I mean, so like a Arimidex is very, is like obviously a go-to, and then I use Nolvadex throughout the prep as well. Those will be the two that I'll use for the majority of prep. I start the prep off with Aromacin, and then I'll switch to the Arimidex. I just think that Aromacin is maybe a little less harsh on cholesterol levels. But like then I switch to Arimidex. I mean, anywhere between 12 and 10 weeks out, their AI that they're going to be using is going to be Arimidex. Then for whatever reason, it's a lot easier to get like real Arimidex, like real Aromacin seems to be like harder and harder to find. So like for whatever reason, my athletes just seem to have an easier time getting the Arimidex, and that's what we'll use. I mean, it depends on, again, it depends on the athlete and what they respond to. So some respond incredibly well to lower levels of estrogen. So like, and obviously estrogen is an essential hormone for fat loss and muscle building, but like sometimes you lower it and you give them a decent amount of AIs and all of a sudden their physique just changes, and in a good way. And it's like, okay, well then this is somebody that you can get away with using maybe a little bit more. Some people really stick, like their body stops changing. They either stop really losing a bunch of fat or whatnot. And it's like, okay, you probably drove estrogen down maybe a little bit too much, and you got to pull back and find the sweet spot for them. That's something that I'm still very much trying to like find, that individual sweet spot with every athlete when it comes to AI usage. But at the end,
mainly with females too.
Yeah, big thing with
like
females.
for
That's
sure with
I
probably the
females.
was
hardest.
going to ask about females, like how you guys approach.
Well, that's the other side of it. Is like when you go with females, like this, Marina, like whether it's tamoxifen, something, but like that's the other thing now. Is like with women, it's like if you use an AI of some sort, like you are the fucking devil.
No, I don't think so.
No,
I think you could use it appropriately. If a female were to lose her cycle, she would naturally become estrogen dominant, and then she would have issues with fat loss from that end. You could use an AI to shrink your ratio or bring in progesterone or something. Which, listen, man, I think when people talk about like you can't do this, you can't do they don't understand enough of it yet. There's application to all these drugs, all these meds. And if you know how to use them, you'll never knock somebody for them using a drug a certain way because you can understand why they're using a drug a certain way.
Right. Yeah.
Is that something that you guys tend to do a lot and bring in like progesterone to balance out that ratio? Or would you rather try to bring down estrogen?
If we're starting
Yes.
prep a little estrogen dominant, I would rather use the progesterone throughout the whole prep. But if it's like you're all of a sudden a month out, you lose your cycle, we probably can't get bioidentical progesterone that fast,
Yeah.
but we could probably get Arimidex pretty quickly. Then during that time frame, maybe we use a small amount. And when I mean a small amount, like I mean like a 1/4 milligram once a week, like just enough to get estrogen lower so that your ratio is not, terrible. You could even use like products like Progon B. It's over-the-counter drops that you could get from Amazon.
That's
It
as
has
close as
40
you're getting to
milligrams of
bioidentical.
progesterone per ml. So like those are quick, easy things that you could do. But I don't think there's anything wrong with using a little Arimidex at the end if you have to, if somebody's pretty severely estrogen dominant.
Mhm.
And then, so what about for you, Dom, with males in general, as far as the estrogen control?
I use Arimidex mostly. To Justin's point, I feel like guys have a hard time finding Aromasin. So I just use Arimidex as the prep goes on, and then I'll usually start people like a 0.5 milligram 2 times a week, work it up to 3, then eventually every other day, then eventually every day. And then the last week we're probably somewhere around 1 milligram a day. I also assess like the level they're competing at. Like if it's a regional high school stadium show, I'm not going to think about using Letro and things like that. If you're a contender for a pro card or we're doing a pro show and you can definitely win, then we're probably going to, pull out every stop we can for it. I think that's another thing when it comes to drug use, assessing the level of competition is a big thing too, because, you don't need to risk it all for a $5 high school trophy when, that's what's really on the line.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
point. And I want to make sure that I put that on record for myself too, because that's exactly how I look at things as well.
Yeah, like dude, like I have people competing tomorrow that look incredible, didn't use any thyroid hormone, didn't use any tren, didn't use any halo, and he's competing for the first time at a local show. He didn't need to, go the whole shebang his first competition.
Yeah.
And he's gonna
Cam,
win.
what do you got?
So
Yeah, there you go. Cam, you got anything to add there?
Yeah, pretty much all the same. I think typically when I'm switching from Aromasin to Arimidex is around the 6 to 8 week out mark. But I mean, pretty much everything else following that is, yeah, we're all on the same page with.
All right. Yeah, I'm glad you guys are there though. I think honestly, again, the way things have shifted here over the last few years, it seems like, even a milligram every other day of Arimidex now somehow has turned into this thing that is like, crazy. And to me, it's like that you're not only is it the look that we're going for, I find like if you're not controlling that estrogen to that extent, and again, to me, a milligram of Arimidex, that is crushing your, especially with the other shit that we're on at that point, whether it is the Winstrol, the Masteron, like that, your estrogen should be low enough at that point to where it's like if you find the need that Letro is gonna continue to have benefit thereafter. I find that's like, I'll be honest, I don't really use Letro that much. You guys work with much higher end athletes, bigger athletes than I do, so I'm sure there's necessity to it at that point. But again, the 1 milligram of Arimidex every other day to me is like, plus the Masteron dosage that we might be at, the Winstrol, like I said before, because I'm a big proponent of the Winstrol. I think Winstrol really helps kind of taper that look in that we're looking for the week up. But yeah, at the end of the day, again, I just see nowadays there's so much talk about how that is like, and again, that's just like, whoever the fuck it might be on Instagram or whatever, but there's just such we demonize that Arimidex and that estrogen control at such a high level. And for me, it's like, I find, what's that?
They would just rather make people bald.
Yeah, well, to me, honestly, it's one of those things where I find it harder because I tried to fuck around with it for a little while. I find it harder to control how dry somebody can get or control that water, right? When we're not using extra to be able to control the estrogen. So that's always been a big one for me. I just find like that's what really helps bring in that look is when we're getting a little bit higher up there with the Arimidex usage than I would on just like, whatever, an off season or leading up to the show.
But like your poison's in your dosage and it's in your
100%,
exposure
yeah,
time.
100%.
So like,
Yeah.
why would it be okay to run DHTs at crazy amounts for 10, 15, 20 weeks, but use AIs for 3 weeks at a high dose?
Yeah.
where's the logic in that? Right?
And
If you're also on orals and like all these DHTs, like you really think the dude's got a good cholesterol panel right now?
Yeah.
It's like if you're trying to accomplish one thing, as in controlling estrogen, why not use a drug that helps control estrogen rather than running a gram of another drug that then probably could cause something else?
Well, it's not even that too. Like everyone's response to E2 control with DHTs is different.
Yeah, 100%. And that's the thing that I don't think that people really grasp. It's like this person's over here saying, oh, when I'm on Primo, it's like, yeah, it crushes my estrogen. It's like, that's great, dude. But I could have somebody else the same dosage of Primo, the same dosage of testosterone.
And it does nothing.
And they're clearly going to need something to help control that
Primo's almost a 50% chance. So 1 out of every 2 people, you get E2 control or you don't. And then Masteron's a huge scale. It's like to some degree you get something, and that's in 80% of people. So it's like for some people it's amazing. For some people it doesn't do anything for them.
Like I could run 500 tests, 300 mass, and my E2 would be tanked. But I could run 500 tests, 800 Primo, feel fantastic.
Yeah. All right. So with that being said, we'll run through these last 2 really quick because I know we're running up on time here. So the first one is going to be GH. Where, when, how are you guys managing that? When are you pulling it as you get closer? If you're pulling it, I guess. And then anything that you guys want to throw in there about, having true and honest farm grade growth versus generic growth at this point. Because I think that's a big concept for me. But Justin, what do you got on the GH?
Yeah, let me answer and then I got to run. So, I use it all year round. So I don't really cycle it out at really any point other than for contest purposes. There'll be periods of time where I raise it and lower it throughout the year, of course, at different, when we're seeking different goals. But like I typically will pull it at the 10-day out mark, just for, again, water retentive purposes. And that's like when I like to start pulling some things down too, like, testosterone, I might pull around 10 days out as well. I'll keep the tren and the like Masteron in until like the Monday before show, especially if I'm doing like more frequent injections. So that way, oil volume isn't super high. But yeah, with growth hormone, I've noticed that there's a big difference in pharma grade versus the generics. And like generics work and they can be very good and they can still cause, IGF scores to spike and everything, which is great. If that's what you can afford, then that's what you can afford. But if you can afford pharma grade, you'll notice the difference in not only how you look, but also how you feel. And I think that, there's less water retentiveness with the pharma GH than with the generics. I think ultimately you get the desired outcome from the GH better with pharma than you do with generics. I don't usually have a ton of issues when it comes to blood sugar control with pharma GH, but I've noticed that the people that use generic GH have a little bit more of an issue. Their blood sugar wants to run a little bit higher. And that's just anecdotal evidence that I've picked up through coaching. I don't have any like theories or anything behind why that is the case. I could chalk it up to quality of the drug and sleep soundly at night thinking that that's what it is. But GH is like one thing that I think everybody should be using. It's virtually side effect free. It's the first thing that I usually ask girls to start taking if they're going to go from being natural to enhanced, for the fact that there's 0 virilization effects and you can get a lot of really good positives from it. And like one thing that I've noticed with pharma is the fullness that you can get and hold from real pharma GH is next level comparatively to generic growth hormone. And that's the biggest difference visually outside of water retention that I think notice. Yeah, right. It's cleaner because there's less water. But yeah, I mean, it's just a difference, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I also think with the pharma, it's like, especially from like when we're talking off season and everything, from like the way that you feel, right? Like from a joint perspective and just like recovery perspective. I was on pharma grade GH for a long time, and I felt amazing. And then as things kind of changed there, with the legality of being able to easily get pharmacy grade through prescription, it was one of those ones where back on generic GH now, I notice a huge difference in terms of joints, recovery, etc. Just not being the same, just not being the same at all.
But all right, guys, I gotta run. I'm late for that appointment. So
thank you guys. Justin, we appreciate you coming on.
Okay, all right, bye-bye.
And anything you want to add to that, Cameron, as far as GH is concerned? And I would also ask you guys real quick, I'm sorry, you can't, but like, are you guys tapering it down at any point? Because I'll know if I have somebody that is at that level and they're, especially we're talking about a pro qualifier, like if there's somebody that's at that 8 unit mark, 10 unit mark, whatever it is, obviously bringing them down along the way a little bit has been a big thing for me in terms of making sure that we clean up the look and clear it up and know what we're working with there.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to hit on. As you're approaching that final month of the prep, all of these changes that you're making are essentially just to try and get that look closer and closer and replicate the environment closer and closer to what it's going to be come show day, right? So at the same time, too, as a coach, whenever you're using compounds that do bring fluid retention into the picture, you've got to work in a way that allows the picture to be as clear as possible and that you can navigate things in a way in the most certain and confident decision-making abilities that you can. And so that's why I will typically taper down the growth hormones. So let's say, if we're using, 4 to 8 IUs a day and it's spaced out over, maybe 3 or even 4 injection frequencies throughout the day, I'll typically start to kind of chop off one of those, or maybe I'll taper them all down a little bit as the prep goes and closes in. I typically won't just completely yank it out, but I will get to a point where I'll taper down to probably just 2 different dosing periods, and then that will come out more than likely around the 10 to 14 day out mark.
Yeah, I usually lower it a little bit throughout the prep towards the end, clean up the look a little bit, kind of tell what's fat, what's water. And then I usually pull it about 10 days out, just for the sake of like bad shots, vasopressin elevations, things like that could skew us. And that's kind of just how I run GH.
And then for lipolytics is the last thing here. So everything from like, the T3, the Clen, if there's anything else that you guys use at that point, the whatever the fuck it might be, albuterol, carnitine, any of the major players that you have from a fat loss perspective, where are you guys going with that? And again, my thought process is the same exactly we've already talked about here, where it's like there's still a lot of results to be had in that 3 to 4 week out window. So that might even be where, I'm starting to, things are at a peak dosage, but then again, as you are trying to load somebody up, that peak week, we're trying to kind of offset some of that cortisol, inflammation, et cetera. How are you guys going about that kind of schedule there, if you would, that process?
Yeah, I usually pull Clen and Yohimbine. Those are really the 2 only lipolytics I use. I usually pull those about 10 days out. Just let sympathetic nervous system activity come down. That'll help clean up some water retention from the stimulants. And then I keep T3 the exact same all throughout peak week, because you're used to refeeding at somebody at that metabolic rate. Every time I've talked to somebody who tries to pull it a lot for the sake of not getting full enough, they have a hard time filling the person out. They usually overshoot because they're used to somebody at this rate. So I just keep everything kind of the same. If it's a really, really hard guy to fill out, then I might reduce it, maybe like 12.5 mics. But other than that, I keep it the exact same.
Yeah, pretty much the same. I've been in a couple cases where, again, let's say we get the stressors down, we kind of get them into a point maybe where the athlete is now at the destination and maybe they had a really stressful home life and now they're just completely burning through everything and they're responding really well. If I've refed them maybe at 7 days out or so, they completely burn through that. I might taper it back by like 12.5 micrograms per day. In the same case, I actually had a female this week that she ended up getting just a bit fluid retentive at around the 7 to 8 day out mark. And I began a reverse diet with her, I think around 2 weeks out, and things were going well for the most part. And then she started to pick up a little bit of fluid. And as I pulled back, like I just couldn't get her really to drop. She was holding. And I brought her up from 25 to 37.5 for the peak week, and things would move super smoothly by doing so. But yeah, for the most part, the good general rule of thumb is just keeping that consistent and just making sure you're not underdoing it or overdoing it in the first place entering the peak week.
I think that's the thing with T3 is knowing, you know what I mean? Like, obviously you're putting that in there specifically because, we're in an environment where our natural hormone production is lower there. You know what I mean? And obviously during peak week, enough things change where sometimes when that natural environment changes, you could have a scenario where that thyroid starts to respond a little bit more efficiently naturally. And if you have too much on top of that, it could drive. Like I had a guy last year that stands out where, he was whatever. 4 weeks out, we're getting blood work done, and his T3 is in the gutter. But sleep was fucked up. Like all this stuff was fucked up. You know what I mean? He had a job where he's working overnights at certain things. Like I guarantee that T3 number that we were looking at on lab work was more a product of, lifestyle on top of the diet. Right. And then as we get closer to the show, that lifestyle starts to go back to normal. I'm sure things start. And then it was impossible to fill him out for the show, even though I dropped him all the way down from 37.5. The doctor actually put him on. I dropped him all the way down to 12.5, and it was just a fucking runaway train. Like there was nothing. And when I say there's nothing I could do, I'm talking Wednesday, we're at McDonald's pounding double quarter pounders, fucking 10 IUs of fucking of Lantus, like, and nothing is working. And that was 2 days in a row we did that. The next day I had him eat an entire box of Rice Krispies, 35 pieces of sushi or something like that. All right, Dom's out here now too.
Sorry,
so
guys,
we'll let
I
you
gotta
go.
jump.
Bye, Dom.
No
Thanks
big
for
deal.
having
We'll
me.
let you go in 2 minutes here, Cam. But yeah, it's just one of those things where I think you got to recognize what the thyroid hormone is doing, and that's one of those things that I really feel like is very dependent, because like you said, you had a female on the opposite side where it was like, hey, we need more, and it's like, yeah, because we're in a spot where you can easily see thyroid go down at that point too. It's just understanding again how that thyroid works. So, all right, well, listen, we've had you guys for a while here, and we appreciate you guys coming on. Obviously, now that everybody's gone,
Yeah.
you're the one guy that we haven't had on the show. I know you and I have had conversations privately, but we haven't had you on the show yet individually. We did get Justin and Dom on, so maybe there's an opportunity for us later to have you back on. I know the season's starting to pick up now, so we'll leave you alone for a little while with scheduling. But anything else that you want to add to this conversation? Because I know we had the other guys for a minute or two before you. So like if there's anything that you want to add here as far as that time frame is concerned, because like I said, the real reason why I wanted to have you guys on it, we've talked to Dom, we've talked to Justin separately, especially the conversation I had with Justin was a long one. And it really this concept stemmed from the idea of, like I've mentioned here plenty of times on this podcast, and I'm not shy about it. I've talked about it openly on multiple different podcasts, especially, the specifics of who I'm talking about, but to leave that away from you, I just want to again, emphasize the reality that, there doesn't have to be one way of doing it, A, and then B, there also doesn't have to be this preconceived notion that, you need to be ready 3 or 4 weeks out. If anything, I find that to be a scenario where you're really risking more potentially with some people being ready 3 or 4 weeks out and trying to hold a look, especially when we're talking about a high level competitor that you guys would know of more than us, just in the sense that, hey, this might be a qualification that I need. I don't need a dude ready in fact, I'm going into a fucking qualification show. Just if I need to qualify for a national level show, I'm going into that fucking 85% sometimes, fucking knowing that I have an athlete there that should be able to handle that fucking level of a stage, right? Get that qualification that we need. And then I'm turning things on when they have another 3 weeks until the pro qualifier. You know what I mean? So is there anything that you want to add to that or the conversation in general?
I think with that whole being ready early thing, as a coach, it's something that sounds really nice because it means you get really nice sleeps leading into the show because you're not stressed about making it on time. But in reality, all it is it's almost like bragging rights for what, at the disparity of the athlete really being in a tough spot. Because if they're ready 3 to 4 weeks out, truly like in shape and condition, that you're risking a lot there. You know what I mean? Especially for someone that might not have been in that type of shape before, which if they have, it should be pretty easy to time that leading into the show really well. And at the same time too, like you get someone that lean 4 weeks out, like their training's probably not going to be in that great of a spot. Their sleep's not going to be too great. They might be able to hold that good, almost like, I don't want to say fresh look because if they've not gone through a peak, they're not going to be fresh. But their look probably could start getting softer just by keeping them that low for that long if they don't know how to manage it and handle it. And really, the biggest thing that I would say again is it's just coaches probably not. I don't want to say not having enough confidence, but I don't know, not really caring enough whether the athlete's going to have to sit in it for that 3 to 4 weeks. Because really, what's accomplished at that point? You know what I mean? Like, if you're ready 3 to 4 weeks out, then you're ready. Like, what's the point? What do you have to do over the next 3 to 4 weeks if they're already ready? I couldn't tell you how many guys, across probably. I know I can definitely speak for myself, but probably Justin and Dom too. shows that we've won pro cards, that we've won even Olympia qualifications, where at 3 weeks out, it's like, we got to push it here. You know what I mean? Like that, it's a totally normal thing. And that's sometimes just that's the pressure of the end of the prep that happens sometimes. But yeah, the whole being ready 3 to 4 weeks out, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, if you were ready, you wouldn't be 3 to 4 weeks out. It would be show day, you know,
Yeah.
because there's
I
so
try to tell
many
people,
changes that are going to be made.
yeah, I try to tell people, like, if that's the case, like, you're unicorn, everything went perfectly, or we overdid it somewhere in some way, shape, or
Yeah.
form. Like, we overdid it somewhere. Now we're ready early. We got to try to hold this, and it wasn't necessary. But I just told one of my coaches yesterday or the day before that, like, dude, we get paid for those last 3 to 4 weeks. Like, that's where we're doing a lot of the work. You know what I mean? It's like that's where probably the most amount of changes are for me, the most amount of, like, communication with that client in terms of looking at the pictures and having those visuals on such a consistent, regular basis. And it might even start a little bit before that, obviously. But again, that 3 or 4 week out mark, that's when I'm like fully invested in this one individual. You know what I mean? Like, there's no questioning what we were just doing or whatever. Whereas in some cases, I might have somebody and I'm like, oh shit, I got to remember what I was doing with this guy last week. You know what I mean? And like go back, look through the notes and all that different shit. Those last 3 to 4 weeks, like I'm fully like I'm waiting for your message to come up all the time. You know what I mean? Like I'm fully invested at that point. That's where we earn our paycheck. But again, yeah, I think I just that whole concept to me, I think the reason why I wanted to go over this with you guys, right? And this is just to kind of give you guys, blow some smoke up your asses, give you guys some praise, is because the one thing that I would say about Camp Jansen that's a little bit different than stuff like you guys are actually doing it. Like I understand Matt's at the top and then you guys are there. But it's almost like the way that I envision it now, having spoken to all three of you guys separately, is that there's still this separation almost. And it's like you guys are teams within a team. And the only reason why I'm bringing this up is because, like I said, I think sometimes a lot of the information that we see coming from some of these educators as it relates to contest prep and bodybuilding specifically, it's almost like, dude, that's great. I understand, like, you're a very intelligent person, knowledgeable. And I'm not saying we can't learn from it, but at the same time, like, I want to know from the person that's doing it right here, right now. I don't care what you did 5 years ago. I want to know, like, what is somebody doing right now to bring the best physiques on stage on a consistent and regular basis? And you guys are doing that while at the same time, educating through your own means, which is, doing podcasts and stuff like this. And, you guys have been so open and so awesome about coming on and kind of sharing that stuff, so you guys are doing it on a regular basis and you guys are able to kind of give this information, where again, I see it in so many other ways where people are too focused on the information, the education, and they're just not doing it on such a regular basis. And to me, this is one of those things where it's like, you could tell me all the fucking research exists in the fucking world. That's great. I don't fucking care. Like, doing it is something that's completely and totally different. You know what I mean?
For sure, 100%. No, I totally agree with you because I mean, that there's when I first got into things, like I tried my best to learn and read and listen to as many things as possible. And, I didn't have any kind of scholar degree. I dropped out of college my like second or third semester. So there was some of the stuff I didn't even know how to break it down and read it and ingest it. But getting the experience and being able to, take a page out of a book and then, take a page out of my spreadsheets and what I'm actually doing and really looking at and combining those together. That's really where the bread and the butter start to meet each other, because I've always told people too that, like, the amount that you learn when you're peaking someone over like a show day weekend, like that 48 to 72 hours there, you'll learn more than you could read over 2 months, or listen to, or whatever it may be. Because the experience, it's everything. Because it's not just knowing how to do things, it's knowing how to coach people and it's knowing how to lead people. And there's two totally different things between knowing how to digest and regurgitate information and actually guiding people and leading people with that information instilled in you. Because I mean, it's contest preps, it's bodybuilders, it's people that are dieted down, that are on drugs, that you got to be able to navigate in certain situations and, keep their head steady and strong and composed leading into a competition. And, it takes experience to be able to know how to do that and get really good at it.
Yeah, 100%. We're with you on that. All right, man. So we appreciate you coming on. Is there anything that you want to leave off with in terms of where people can find you, all that good stuff?
Yeah, I mean, all three of us can find us on the Camp Jansen website, also on our Instagram pages. Mine is Cameron_Cheek. Oh man, I don't want to butcher the other two guys, but I know.
I don't.
I'll link it all below.
I was
There
gonna
you
say we'll link it all, but I know if you
Perfect.
look up Jacoby, you're gonna find him pretty easily. He's got
Sure.
the fucking Bart thing on there, and then Dom Kuz. I don't know how many Dom Kuzes there are, so I'm
Yeah.
sure you can search him on Instagram
Many.
and he probably come right up. But we'll make sure it's all in there. So again, dude, we appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and I'm more than happy to get on here another time whenever you guys want to schedule that.
Well, maybe trying to do something on peak week would be a good follow up to this, like specifically those last few days, like that last, like, whatever, Wednesday to Saturday, and kind of going over all that in detail would be cool. So we'll reach
Yeah.
out for that for sure. But I know you're busy here this weekend, so we'll hold that off for a little bit.
Sounds good, man. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks, Cam.
Absolutely.
Thank you to Dom and Justin who aren't here, but I think this was a very valuable episode. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll catch you guys next week.